I'm a former Correctional Registered Nurse, a title I held for less than a year at the Blackwood Mountain Correctional Facility, a maximum security state prison nestled so deep in the Appalachians you felt like the mountains themselves were part of the walls. Before that, I was a city paramedic for 15 years. I've worked the controlled chaos of festival collapses and the grim silence of multi-car pileups on icy highways. I've responded to over 5,000 calls in my career, everything from gunshot wounds in back alleys to heart attacks in penthouse suites. I thought I understood the spectrum of human suffering. I've seen the aftermath of terrible choices and the cruel randomness of fate, and I believed I knew the boundaries of what one person could do to another. But a little over a year ago, my very first day inside that prison introduced me to a case that changed everything I thought I knew about medicine, justice, and the quiet, bureaucratic face of evil. What happened was so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that I resigned from a profession I had dedicated my life to. This case, and the inmate at the center of it, haunts me in a way that no street-level tragedy ever did. What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about the systems we trust to keep us safe, because it sounds impossible, but every word of it is true. The decision to leave the paramedic service wasn't an easy one. 15 years of sirens, adrenaline, and street-level medicine had worn me down. The constant churn of trauma, the burnout, the feeling that I was just putting bandages on a hemorrhaging society. It was taking its toll. My back ached, my sleep was a wreck, and I was starting to see the ghosts of calls in the faces of strangers. The job at Blackwood Mountain Correctional seemed like a logical next step. A pay increase, regular hours, a pension, and a controlled environment. The irony of seeking control in a maximum security prison wasn't lost on me, but I reasoned that at least the chaos would be predictable. I knew there would be violence, shanks, fights, overdoses, but it would be contained. I would be treating a captive audience, literally. My job would be to provide care, to uphold a small piece of human dignity in a place designed to strip it away. I saw it as a new chapter, a different kind of service. My orientation was a blur of steel doors, echoing hallways, and the constant, low hum of institutional life. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the smells of industrial cleaner, stale sweat, and a kind of low-grade, simmering despair. I was given a set of keys that felt like a lead weight in my pocket, a radio that crackled with codes and terse commands, and a lecture on the golden rules. Never trust an inmate, never show weakness, and never, ever become complacent. The infirmary was my new domain. It was a sterile, beige island in a sea of gray concrete and blue uniforms. It had a small triage area, a few examination rooms, a locked pharmacy, and a 4-bed ward for inmates too sick for general population but not sick enough for an outside hospital. My guide for the day was a senior nurse named Brenda. She was a woman in her late 50s with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and a demeanor to match. She'd been at Blackwood for 20 years and moved with a kind of weary, cynical efficiency. "Forget what you learned on the street," she told me, her voice flat. "Out there, your patient is the priority. In here, security is the priority. Always. We patch him up so the COs can lock him back down. That's the job." She showed me the paperwork, a mountain of it for every single interaction. We used a system of triplicate forms, color-coded for different departments. Everything had to be documented, signed, and countersigned. It was bureaucracy as a shield. The first few hours were a gentle introduction to the rhythm of prison medicine. We dealt with a line of inmates for sick call. A guy with a chronic skin rash, a diabetic needing his insulin dose checked, another complaining of a toothache, probably hoping for some stronger pain meds. It was mundane, routine stuff. Brenda handled them with a detached professionalism, her questions short, her mannerisms betraying a deep-seated boredom. I followed her lead, trying to absorb the protocols, the unique dynamic of treating a patient who is also a prisoner, always with a corrections officer, a CO standing just a few feet away, a silent, watchful presence. The CO assigned to medical that day was a big man named Officer Miller, whose face was a permanent mask of impassive authority. Around 1 p.m., the relative quiet was broken. The infirmary door buzzed open and 2 COs escorted an inmate inside. This was different from the sick call line. The inmate wasn't walking under his own power. They were half carrying, half dragging him, his feet shuffling on the linoleum. He was a wiry man, maybe in his late 30s, with a pale, drawn face and eyes that were wide with something more than pain. It was a deep, hunted fear. "What we got?" Brenda asked, not even looking up from the chart she was finishing. "Inmate Jones, Silas." Slipped and fell down the stairs in C block. One of the COs said, his tone wrote as if reading from a script, "Needs to be checked out." I stepped forward, my paramedic instincts kicking in. "Let's get him on the table." They hoisted him onto the examination table, and he let out a low moan. I started my initial assessment, the familiar ABCs: airway, breathing, circulation. His breathing was shallow but regular. I took his wrist to check his pulse. It was thready and fast. His skin was clammy. As I was doing this, I noticed Brenda hadn't moved. She was still at her desk, slowly clicking her pen. Officer Miller stood by the door, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the inmate. "I'm gonna get his vitals," I said, reaching for the blood pressure cuff. "Just document the fall," Brenda said, still not looking at me. "Give him some ibuprofen, send him back." C-block stairs are slick. Happens all the time. Something felt wrong. It was a palpable sense of disinterest that went beyond simple burnout. Felt practiced. I ignored her for a moment and continued my assessment. I asked the inmate, "Silas, can you tell me where it hurts?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. "Can you hear me? My name is Mark. I'm one of the nurses here. I need you to tell me what happened," I said, my voice calm and steady, the way I'd spoken to 1,000 scared patients. His eyes flickered towards me, just for a second. In that brief moment, I saw a flash of desperate intelligence. A plea. And then it was gone, replaced by a vacant stare. He was terrified, but it wasn't the kind of fear I was used to seeing. It wasn't the fear of a rival inmate or of getting in trouble. It was the fear of the men in uniform who were standing right there in the room with us. I gently palpated his ribs, and he winced sharply, sucking in a breath. "Possible rib fractures," I said to Brenda. "He needs an X-ray, and his pupils are a little sluggish. We should rule out a concussion." Brenda finally sighed, stood up, and walked over. She gave Silas a cursory glance. "He looks fine. The report says he slipped. We document the slip. We give him pain meds for the slip. We send him back to his cell." She looked directly at me, her eyes hard. "You're new. Here's your first lesson. We treat what's on the paper. The paper says slip and fall. Got it?" This was my first real taste of institutional betrayal. My training, my ethics, my entire professional identity was screaming at me that this man needed a proper workup. But the system, embodied by this veteran nurse, was telling me to shut up and fill out a form. I felt a surge of professional inadequacy, a feeling that my skills were being actively rejected. "With all due respect, Brenda," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "my assessment suggests his injuries could be more severe than a simple fall. A fall down a flight of stairs can cause internal bleeding, head trauma. Our duty," she cut me off, her voice dropping to a low, warning tone, "is to not make waves, especially on your first day." She turned to the COs. "He's good. Take him back." I was stunned. I looked from her to the passive COs, to the inmate on the table who now seemed to shrink into himself, the flicker of hope in his eyes completely extinguished. They were going to send a potentially seriously injured man back to his cell based on a verbal report that didn't match his physical signs. It was more than just negligence. It felt like a conspiracy of indifference. A growing sense that something was profoundly, systemically wrong began to settle in my gut. This wasn't just about a single patient. This was about the entire culture of the place. My first day, my first real patient, and I was already being told to be complicit in a lie. I watched them help Silas off the table, his movements stiff and pained. As he passed me, his eyes met mine again. He mouthed a single silent word. A word I couldn't quite make out, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. It was a warning. My first day as a prison medic had just begun, and already I was standing on the edge of a chasm I never knew existed. The rest of that first day, and indeed the entire first week was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. I performed my duties as instructed. I treated fungal infections, changed dressings on minor wounds, and dispensed medication through a small slot in a steel door. I filled out the triplicate forms, my pen strokes feeling more like an act of forgery with each signature. The case of Silas Jones gnawed at me. Every time a CO's radio crackled, I expected to hear a call for a man down in C block. Every time a door buzzed, I braced myself for them to be dragging him back in, this time in worse shape. I tried to bring it up with Brenda again, a few days later, approaching it casually. "Hey, you know that inmate from my first day, Jones? Just wondering how he's doing. Ever see him back for a follow-up?" She was counting out pills into little paper cups, her movements precise and automatic. "Jones? Oh, the fall guy. He's fine. If he wasn't, he'd be back on the sick call list. No news is good news in here." She didn't look at me. Her message was clear: drop it. But I couldn't. I was trained to see patterns, to connect symptoms to causes. The pattern here wasn't medical. It was procedural. The way the COs recited the slip and fall line, the way Brenda immediately defaulted to a protocol of dismissal, the sheer terror in Silas's eyes. It didn't add up. On the street, if I brought in a patient with injuries inconsistent with the story, it would trigger questions: a possible police investigation for assault, a social worker consult for domestic violence. In here, the inconsistency was the protocol. It was troubling. My paramedic background had taught me the importance of documentation. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So I started my own documentation. In a small, cheap notebook I bought at a gas station, I began to write. I detailed the encounter with Silas Jones, his physical symptoms, his nonverbal cues, Brenda's, and the COS reactions. I wrote down the date, the time, the names of the officers. Felt paranoid, but it also felt necessary. It was my own personal chain of custody for a truth I felt was being deliberately obscured. Over the next few weeks, I began my own quiet, systematic investigation. I started paying closer attention to the inmates who were brought in for accidents. A burn from the kitchen that looked too symmetrical. A sprained ankle from the laundry, but with bruising on the man's upper arm that looked like a handprint. Each time, the story was neat, tidy, and delivered with the same sterile recitation by the escorting COs. Inmate Smith slipped on a wet floor. Inmate Rodriguez caught his hand in a machine. And each time, Brenda would oversee a cursory treatment, prescribe some basic pain relief, and sign the paperwork. I started cross-referencing the names. Using my access to the infirmary's digital records, a clunky, outdated system, but it had the data. I looked for patterns. And I found one. The inmates with these convenient, hard-to-disprove injuries were almost all housed in C block, the same block as Silas Jones. Furthermore, most of them were assigned to the same work detail, Prison Industries, specifically the furniture workshop. It was a program lauded by the state for teaching inmates valuable skills. But something was going wrong in that workshop. My attempts to find out more were met with a wall of institutional resistance. When I put in a formal request for the accident logs from the workshop, citing a need to review safety protocols, my request was denied by the deputy warden's office. The reason given was security concerns. When I tried to talk to the inmates from C block during sick call, asking them about their work conditions, they would clam up. They'd look past me, towards the ever-present CO, and mumble something non-committal. The fear was a tangible thing, a third presence in the examination room. This is when my moral isolation became acute. I was the only one who seemed to see this, or at least the only one willing to acknowledge it. I felt like I was taking crazy pills. Was I just a naive outsider who didn't understand the rough culture of prison life? Was this just some kind of inmate fight club or gang intimidation that the staff tacitly allowed in order to maintain a fragile peace? I tried to rationalize it, to find an explanation that fit within the known, brutal world of a maximum security prison. But it didn't fit. The injuries weren't just brutal. They were often strange. The burn that looked like a chemical reaction, not a heat source. The inmate who complained of persistent, debilitating headaches and dizziness after a fall, classic post-concussion symptoms, but was denied a neurological consult. My relationship with Brenda grew colder. She watched me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "You're a good medic, Mark," she said to me one afternoon, after I'd pushed a little too hard for an X-ray on an inmate with a jammed finger that was clearly broken. "But you're not a detective, and this place will chew up and spit out detectives. Do your job. That's all they ask." "And what is my job, Brenda?" I asked, my frustration finally boiling over. "Is it to practice medicine, or is it to help you cover up whatever the hell is going on in C-Block?" Her face hardened. "You need to be careful. You have no idea what you're talking about." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, the weight of the institution pressing down on me. The stakes were rising. I started to feel like I was the one being watched. Officer Miller, the CO who had been there on my first day, seemed to be assigned to the infirmary more and more often when I was on shift. He'd stand a little closer, his silence feeling less like professional detachment and more like a threat. One evening, I came back to my locker after a shift to find the lock broken. Nothing was stolen, but my things were rifled through. My spare uniform was on the floor. It was a message, a shakedown. "Stop digging." My personal investment was now total. This wasn't just about professional curiosity anymore. It was about my oath as a medical provider. The Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, doesn't have a caveat for a patient's criminal record. These men, whatever they had done on the outside, were my patients on the inside. My protective instinct, honed over 15 years of responding to cries for help, was screaming at me. They were vulnerable, and the very system charged with their care was the source of their harm. This was a perversion of everything I believed in. One day, an inmate from the sick call line, a young kid in for robbery, saw me looking at the C-Block roster on my screen. He was there for an antacid. As he was leaving, he palmed a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper, a kite, and pressed it into my hand during the brief moment the CO was looking down the hall. My heart hammered in my chest. I slipped it into my pocket, my movements stiff with adrenaline. Later, in the privacy of a bathroom stall, I unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky. It contained just 3 things. A number, B17, a name, Ethelred, and a drawing of a small, distinct symbol, like a stylized serpent eating its own tail, but with a needle in the center. I had no idea what it meant. Ethelred sounded like something out of medieval history. B17 could be a cell number, a batch number, anything. The symbol was the most troubling part. It looked like a corporate logo. It looked clinical. The pieces were starting to connect, but the picture they were forming was impossible. It was something far stranger and more sinister than gang violence. I went home that night and added the note to my secret file. I felt a cold dread creeping into my bones. The mystery was deepening, and I had a terrible feeling that I was getting dangerously close to the truth, a truth that the entire institution was built to protect. The kite became the Rosetta Stone for my investigation. Ethelred. It sounded archaic, almost absurd in the context of a modern prison. I spent hours online, running searches for Ethelred Prison, Ethelred Medicine, Ethelred B17. I found nothing. It was a dead end. The symbol, however, was a different story. It was so specific. I sketched it from memory into my notebook, and then, on my home computer, I tried to replicate it using basic drawing software. I ran an image search. For days, I got nothing but pictures of the Ouroboros, ancient alchemical symbols, and snake tattoos. I was about to give up, to write it off as some kind of inmate gang sign I wasn't privy to. Then I tweaked my search terms. I added words from my growing list of suspicions: pharmaceutical, medical trial, research. And then, buried on the 4th page of the search results, I got a hit. It was a link to a cached version of a web page from a defunct European biotech company. The company's name was Ethelred Laboratories. The page was from a decade ago, detailing their work in advanced neurological pharmacology. And there, at the top of the page, was their logo, a stylized serpent eating its own tail with a hypodermic needle in the center. My blood ran cold. Ethelred. It wasn't a person's name. It was a company, a pharmaceutical company, a defunct one, supposedly, but their logo was being passed around on a secret note inside a maximum security prison. The puzzle pieces slammed together with a sickening force. The accidents, the clinical, unusual injuries, the headaches and dizziness, the secrecy, the institutional cover-up. It wasn't a fight club. It wasn't random brutality. It was systematic. It was controlled. This was a human trial, an illegal, off-the-books drug trial being conducted on prisoners. Suddenly, everything made a horrifying kind of sense. The resistance from the administration wasn't about protecting COs from scrutiny over excessive force. It was about protecting a secret and likely very profitable arrangement. The slip and fall stories weren't lazy excuses. They were a coordinated, pre-planned cover for adverse reactions to an experimental drug. The inmates in C Block weren't just a random assortment of prisoners. They were a pool of test subjects. And B-17, I now suspected, wasn't a cell. It was the designation for the drug itself. The feeling of professional inadequacy I'd felt on my first day was now dwarfed by a profound sense of horror. I wasn't just a cog in a broken system. I was an unwitting employee of a laboratory. The infirmary wasn't a place of healing. It was a clean-up station for a monstrous experiment. My attempts at rational explanation, gangs, guards' brutality, all failed because the truth was so far outside the realm of normal corruption that I couldn't even conceive of it. The reality was so much worse. It was a betrayal not just of prison policy, but of the fundamental ethics of medicine. I had to tell someone, but who? The deputy warden was the one who had blocked my request for the safety logs. He was likely in on it. The warden himself? Unlikely. He was ignorant of such a major operation happening under his nose. The state's Department of Corrections? How could I, a new nurse with a wild conspiracy theory, get past the institutional barriers designed to stop exactly this kind of complaint? They would bury me in paperwork and disciplinary actions before I ever got to speak to someone with real power. They would paint me as a disgruntled employee, a paranoid rookie. My only potential ally was Brenda. She had warned me off, yes, but her warnings had a strange quality to them. It wasn't the aggressive defensiveness of someone like Officer Miller. It was a weary, almost pained resignation. She knew. I was sure of it. She had been there for 20 years watching this happen and had made a bitter peace with it. I had to try to break that peace. I chose my moment carefully. It was the end of a long shift. The infirmary was quiet. Miller had been replaced by a younger CO who was more interested in the sports section of the newspaper than in us. I walked over to Brenda's desk. I took out my phone and pulled up the cached image of the Ethelred Labs logo. I placed it on the desk in front of her without a word. She glanced at it. Her face, usually an unreadable mask, went slack. For a split second, I saw 20 years of buried conscience surface in her eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. She didn't feign ignorance. She didn't ask where I got it. She just stared at the symbol. "You need to forget you ever saw that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to burn that little notebook you carry around, and you need to forget all about this. For your own good." "How can you do this, Brenda?" My voice was shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "How can you watch this happen? These are our patients." She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were wet. "They told me it was a vitamin supplement study," she said, her voice cracking. "Years ago. Said it was to help with inmate nutrition. Then the accidents started. Minor things at first. Rashes. Nausea. I asked questions. I was told to mind my own business. I saw a nurse, a good man named David, get fired and framed for stealing meds because he pushed too hard. I have a mortgage, Mark. A daughter in college. I have 3 years until I get my full pension. What am I supposed to do? What were you supposed to do?" The institutional betrayal was complete. It wasn't just the warden or the COs. It was the system itself, a system that could pressure a good person into complicity through fear and financial dependency. Brenda's confession didn't absolve her, but it explained her. She was another victim of the system, trapped in a different kind of prison. "We can stop it," I said, leaning closer. "I have notes. Dates, names, injuries. This logo, this company, it's proof. We can go to the state police, to the attorney general. They'll crush you, she said, shaking her head. This isn't just the warden, Ethelred. They're not just some fly-by-night operation. They have connections. They have money. The prison gets a kickback for every volunteer. It's a revenue stream. You're not fighting the warden, you're fighting a budget line. The sheer, calculated evil of it was staggering. They had monetized the bodies of these men. My protective instinct flared into a cold rage. I wasn't just a medic anymore. I was the only advocate these men had. I don't care, I said, my voice low and firm. I can't not do this, but I can't do it alone. I need your help, Brenda. You know where the real files are. Not the fake ones in the computer, but the hard copies. The intake forms that were filled out before they were corrected for the official record. They have to exist somewhere. She looked at the logo on my phone, then at my face. I saw a flicker of the nurse she must have been 20 years ago, before the cynicism had calcified around her heart. The moral isolation I had felt for weeks began to crack. I wasn't entirely alone anymore. There's a records room in the sub-basement, she said, her decision made. Old paper files are archived there. If there's a real record of what they're doing, it would be there. But it's a high-security area. Getting in there, it's impossible. Nothing is impossible, I said, my mind already racing, formulating a plan. We just need a diversion. A big one. The plan was desperate, reckless, and hinged on the one thing we had in abundance. Medical emergencies. We had to create a crisis large enough to pull the most senior COs, including Miller, away from their regular posts and, crucially, away from the administrative wing that housed the entrance to the sub-basement. It was a terrible choice, a calculated risk that felt like a violation of my own principles. We weren't going to harm anyone, but we were going to fake a major incident. Brenda knew the protocol for a suspected infectious outbreak, something like meningitis or tuberculosis. It would trigger a partial lockdown of a cell block and require the personal oversight of the shift commander and senior medical staff, namely her. That would be her role. My role was to create the initial panic. I identified my patient zero. It was the young inmate who had passed me the kite. He was a low-level offender, scared but smart, and I sensed he was trustworthy. During sick call for a minor complaint, I explained the situation in hushed, rapid tones. I told him I needed him to fake a seizure to make it look as real as possible. I described the symptoms, the thrashing, the foaming at the mouth, which we'd simulate with a small bit of soap he could conceal. It was a huge risk for him. If he was caught, he'd be sent to solitary, the SHU, for months. But he looked at me, his young face grim, and nodded. For Silas, he whispered. The next day, in the middle of the afternoon count, it happened. The call went out over the radio. Man down, B block, possible seizure. The prison's emergency protocols kicked into high gear. As the senior nurse on duty, Brenda responded, her voice calm and authoritative over the radio, directing a quarantine of the tier and demanding the shift commander meet her on site. As I'd hoped, Officer Miller and 2 other senior COs were dispatched to B block to manage the lockdown. The administrative wing was suddenly short-staffed, its attention focused elsewhere. This was our window. It would be small. With Brenda's keycard, which she had accidentally left on her desk, I made my way to the administrative hallway. My heart was a drum against my ribs. Every footstep echoed. I was a medic, a healer, and here I was, breaking a dozen rules, my actions closer to espionage than nursing. I reached the door marked, Archival Storage, Level 3 Clearance. I swiped the card. The light blinked green, and the lock clicked open. The sub-basement was cold and smelled of damp concrete and decaying paper. It was a labyrinth of gray metal shelves, stretching into the gloom, each one packed with cardboard boxes and dusty binders. It was a graveyard of secrets. Brenda had told me where to look. Files from the last 5 years, sectioned off by work detail. I found the area for Prison Industries Furniture Workshop. The boxes were heavy, coated in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had touched them in years. I started pulling them down, my hands shaking, prying open the lids. Most were what I expected. standard personnel files, work assignments, disciplinary reports. But in the third box, tucked underneath a stack of routine safety violation forms, I found it. It was a single, thick, red binder. It had no official prison markings. The only label was a small, embossed symbol on the spine. The Ethelred logo. I opened it. It wasn't a collection of prison forms. It was a clinical trial ledger. Page after page of detailed scientific data. Each page was a profile of an inmate. It listed their prison ID number, their age, their pre-existing medical conditions, and then a series of dates and notations. Subject 47. Administered 10 cubic centimeters, B17. Onset of nausea 1 hour. Severe migraine reported 3 hours. Uncontrolled aggression 6 hours. Then a final, chilling entry. Adverse event managed per protocol. Official report. Altercation with cellmate. Subject transferred to segregation. Another page. Subject 52. Administered 15 cubic centimeters, B17. Experienced temporary paralysis in lower limbs. Official report. Slip and fall on wet surface. It was all there. A meticulous, cold-blooded record of their experiment. And there, on a page near the middle, was the entry that made my breath catch in my throat. Subject 23, Silas Jones. It detailed how he had been a part of the trial for 6 months. It listed his dose, B17, and a series of escalating adverse reactions. The final entry was from the day I had met him. Subject reported paresthesia and chest pains. Official report. Slip and fall downstairs. They knew. They knew exactly what was wrong with him and deliberately wrote a false report, leaving him in my care with no information. The binder was the smoking gun. It was the undeniable truth of the conspiracy. Just as I was about to close it, I heard a sound from the hallway, the heavy clang of a door. Footsteps. My blood turned to ice. They knew. Someone had figured it out. I had to get out, but the only way out was the way I came in. I grabbed the binder, my mind racing. I couldn't be caught with it. The door to the records room creaked open. I ducked behind a tall shelf, pressing myself into the cold metal, my breathing shallow. Officer Miller stepped into the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He wasn't supposed to be here. The diversion was supposed to have kept him occupied. "I know you're in here, Mark." His voice was low, conversational, which was somehow more terrifying than if he had been yelling. "Brenda is a creature of habit. She hasn't misplaced her keycard in 20 years. You made a mistake thinking you could play games in my house." His light swept across the shelves, getting closer. I was trapped. My career, my freedom, my life. It all felt like it was about to end in this dusty, forgotten basement. I clutched the red binder to my chest. This proof could not be lost. In that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be taken quietly. I wasn't going to let this be buried. As his light fell on the shelf next to mine, I braced myself, ready to run, ready to fight, ready to do whatever it took to get that binder out into the light. The truth was finally in my hands, and I realized with sickening clarity that understanding it was one thing, but surviving it was another thing entirely. Miller's flashlight beam swept past my hiding spot, the cone of light illuminating a cloud of disturbed dust motes just inches from my face. He took another step into the room. "The warden is a reasonable man," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "He appreciates loyalty. He understands that people can be misled. Give me the file and we can forget this ever happened. You can transfer to another facility. No harm, no foul." It was the classic offer. The institutional pressure valve. A chance to walk away, to save myself and let the horror continue unabated. For a fleeting moment I considered it. The thought of my life returning to normal was a powerful lure. But then I thought of Silas Jones. I thought of the kid in B Block who had risked the SHU to help me. I thought of the dozens of other names in that binder, men who were being treated as little more than lab rats. My professional duty, the very core of my identity as a caregiver, wouldn't let me accept. The moral isolation I'd felt was now a righteous certainty. This was bigger than my career. I didn't answer him, I stayed perfectly still, clutching the binder. My silence was my answer. All right, Miller sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. Have it your way. He took another step, and that's when the prison's main alarm system blared to life. Not the medical alert, but the full-scale emergency klaxon, a deafening, whooping siren that signified a riot or an escape. It was a sound designed to command the absolute, immediate attention of every single CO in the facility. From the radio on Miller's belt, a frantic voice shouted, "Code Red! Code Red! Disturbance in the mess hall. All units respond." Miller froze. He was torn. His duty was to respond to the Code Red. His personal mission was to stop me. He looked towards the door, then back into the darkness where he knew I was hiding. The alarm was my salvation. It was a 1 in a million stroke of luck, a completely unrelated event that had just saved my life. He made his choice. "This isn't over," he snarled into the darkness, and then he turned and ran, his boots clanging on the metal stairs as he raced to join the response. I didn't wait. I scrambled out from behind the shelf and ran for the door, the red binder tucked under my arm like a football. The hallways were a controlled chaos of COs running towards the mess hall. In the confusion, no one paid any attention to a nurse moving briskly in the opposite direction. I made it back to the infirmary, my heart pounding. Brenda was there, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked. "I got it," I said, showing her the binder. Miller almost had me, but the riot alarm went off. "Riot?" She looked confused. "There's no riot. I started it." I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "When Miller didn't stay put, I knew he was coming for you," she explained, her voice quick and low. "I couldn't trigger another medical alert, so I called the main switchboard using the infirmary line. Disguised my voice, said I was a CO in the mess hall, that a fight had broken out and a guard was down. It's the one call that guarantees a full facility response. They'll figure out it was a hoax in 10 minutes, but I figured 10 minutes was all you'd need. I was floored. The jaded, cynical nurse who had told me to stand down, who had made her peace with the devil, had just risked her entire career, her pension, everything to save me, to do the right thing. In that moment, she wasn't a victim of the system anymore. She was the one who broke it. There was no time for thanks. We knew what we had to do. We couldn't go through the prison channels. We couldn't trust the Department of Corrections. We had to go outside and we had to go public. Brenda made a call to a trusted cousin, a journalist at the state's largest newspaper. I used my cell phone to take clear, high-resolution pictures of every single page in the red binder. The names, the dosages, the falsified reports. We documented the document. Then we walked out. It was the end of our shift. We clocked out, handed in our keys, and walked out the main gate of Blackwood Mountain Correctional Facility for the last time. Felt like walking out of a tomb. That night, we met the journalist in a dingy diner 100 miles away. I handed over the binder. Brenda gave her testimony, a 20-year history of quiet complicity and last-minute courage. I told my story, from my first day with Silas Jones to the sub-basement. The story broke 2 days later. It was an explosion. House of Horrors, illegal drug trials at Blackwood Prison. The Ethelred name, the falsified reports, the testimony of 2 medical whistleblowers. It was all there. The state government was forced to act. The Attorney General launched a full-scale investigation. The FBI got involved. The warden, the deputy warden, and Officer Miller were immediately suspended, and later indicted. Ethelred Laboratories, which had been operating through a series of shell corporations, was exposed. Its executives were charged. The professional consequences were swift. Brenda and I were fired, of course, for breach of protocol and theft of sensitive documents. But by then, it didn't matter. The truth was out. The personal cost was immense. My career in correctional medicine was over before it had barely begun. I was blacklisted. The legal battle was draining, requiring months of depositions and testimony. I had to acknowledge the career sacrifice I had made. I had traded my stability and my profession for the truth. The resolution was, in many ways, incomplete. Justice was served, but it felt hollow. A few men in suits went to prison for a few years. The system churned on. A new warden was appointed. New COs were hired. The inmates from the trial were transferred to a medical facility. Their ultimate fates lost in a sea of litigation and confidential settlements. I never found out what happened to Silas Jones. I hope he found peace, but the not knowing is a weight I still carry. The experience shattered my worldview. My time as a paramedic had shown me the fragility of the human body. My time at Blackwood showed me the depravity of the human soul when shielded by institutional power. It changed me forever. I couldn't go back to medicine. I couldn't look at a patient without seeing the system they were trapped in. I couldn't trust the institutions I was once proud to be a part of. The ongoing impact of that case is that I live with a constant questioning of the line between healing and harm, between justice and control. That's why I left. And that's why I'm telling you this story. Because the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones locked behind bars. They're the ones who hold the keys.